oaths of office, are these just ceremonial things that take place when an individual is elected to a high office, or is this actually something that is a foundation to our republic? Today, we're going to discuss that. Welcome to American Made. I'm your host, Andrew Muller. So glad to be here with you. I'm repping my St. Louis Cardinals polo as we head into the MLB postseason, although my beloved Cardinals didn't have a chance. I am still repping them and actually going to do something very radical here, support the Chicago Cubs for the World Series. I think they have a good shot. Of course, the Cardinals have a brutal rivalry with the Chicago Cubs, but the Chicago Cubs were the favorite team of Charlie Kirk. So in honor of Charlie, I'm going to go against my nature and support the Cubs all the way to the World Series. So hope you join me in doing that. So today we're going to discuss oaths of office. This is a topic I've been interested in for a long period of time because a lot of people think that the oath of office is just a ceremonial happening. That's just something that you do when you're elected to office. But actually, when you look into the history of the oath of office, you look what the founding fathers said about the oath of office, it actually highlights and underscores the Christian principles, the Christian nationalist principles of our constitutional republic. So we are going to get into that today. But before we do, I want to give a shout out to Alp, American Lip Pillow. I've got one in right now. Otherwise, I would do my little ceremonious QVC trial and stick one in live on camera. But I already have one in, so I'm not going to double up. But Alp is amazing. It's a nicotine pouch. Now, you might hear nicotine and you think, oh, cancer, addiction, a whole bunch of bad stuff. Well, actually, if you look into it, the bad side effects, the bad lifestyle that comes from overconsumption of nicotine isn't really from nicotine pouches. Instead, it's from the use of chewing tobacco, cigarettes, these addictive chemicals that are added into those things. But Alp does not have any addictive, harmful, carcinogenic chemicals added to it. It's just nicotine. So you need to head over to Alp, scan the QR code on the screen. You will get 10% off your first order. Also support the broadcast, support Tucker Carlson, who we love. Shout out to Tucker and these great American lip pillows known as Alp. They come in some tremendous flavors: mountain wintergreen, spearmint, sweet nectar, cool mint, chill mint, whole bunch of amazing stuff. Highly recommend them, and you support the broadcast. So let's get into this idea of an oath of office. Now, before we dive into this, I do want to define some terms. So the case I'm going to be making to you today is that without Christianity, without the Christian morals, without the biblical Christian worldview thriving in our society, without the biblical Christian worldview being possessed by our leaders, our constitutional republic doesn't operate. Now, a lot of people will listen to that and they will say, so you're advocating for Christian nationalism, you're advocating for theocracy. These things are widely misunderstood. Now, theocracy has never been a understood discussion that people have. They think of theocracy and they think of something like some Islamic dictatorship in the Middle East where you have to submit to the religion of the state or otherwise you are going to be stoned or killed or censored. That's not what we're talking about. But every nation does operate under a set of presuppositions. Every nation does operate under a set moral code, if they like it or not, whether that be atheism, whether that be Islam, whether that be secularism, whether that be leftism, whether that be progressivism, whether that be Christianity. Now, I would argue that if you look at nations that are built upon the foundation of Christianity, those nations are the most prosperous, the most free, the most charitable, the most desirable to live in. And it is obvious that America was built as a Christian nation. So it should make sense that since that's the moral foundation of our republic, that our leaders would abide by those moral principles, or at the very least, they wouldn't act against them. They wouldn't act in a way that's counterintuitive to those principles. So I just want to first say Christian nationalism shouldn't be a scary phrase because let's break it down, right? Let's start from the back. The word nationalism, right? I am a nationalist because you know what I'm not? I'm not a globalist. And nations were God's idea. They weren't man's idea. They were God's idea. Globalism is the exact opposite of what God designed. The globalists want to tear down national sovereignty. They want to tear down individual sovereignty. And they want to go from an individualist, nationalist point of view to a collectivist, globalist point of view, where there would be no borders, there would be no sovereignty, there would be no separation of powers vertically and horizontally. There would just be global domination, global control. Well, what happens to your rights? Your rights given from God, protected by government? That's a great question. They would most likely dissipate. And there's great biblical precedents for this. Acts 17:26 says, and he, talking about God, from one man, Adam, every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, i.e., God made nations. This was not man's idea. This was God's idea. This is also articulated in Genesis 11, the Tower of Babel. If you read Genesis 11, you will see that the scripture says clearly, now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as people migrated from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, come, let us make bricks and burn them thoroughly. And they had brick for stone, bitumen for mortar. And they said, come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens. And let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of man had built. And the Lord said, behold, they are one people, and they have one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Verse 7, come, let us go down there and confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord dispersed them from there all over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore, its name was called Babel, because the Lord confused the language of the earth, and the Lord dispersed them over all the face of the earth. Then you take in context Acts 17:26, that the Lord made allotted periods and boundaries of their dwelling place. You also read Nehemiah, the building of the wall. These ideas of borders, of nations, of sovereignty is God's idea. So it's okay to be a nationalist. It's actually right to be a nationalist, because the alternative to that is to be a globalist. And that is ultimately what the book of Revelation says we are going to head to, a one world system of government. But Christ has already conquered that through sending his son to die on the cross. He will come back and set everything in straight and usher in eternity and the end of the age. But we know that globalism is wrong. So it's okay to be a nationalist. And then we look at prior episodes of this show, you will see that America was built as a Christian nation. So you're either going to have secular nationalism, you're going to have Islamic nationalism, or you're going to have Christian nationalism. Now, the great and late Voddie Baucham, who was a very strong advocate of nationalism, also a strong advocate of Americanism, recently died. He was 56 years old, died of a medical emergency. Here's what Voddie Baucham said about Christian nationalism. Here's clip 1.
You just stop and think about it for a minute, right? Okay, if you don't want Christian nationalism, what other kind of nationalism do you want?
Yeah.
Right? Do you want, secular nationalism, Muslim nationalism, and or if it's not the Christianity that's the problem, is it the nationalism that's the problem? If we don't want nationalism, what do we want? Do we want globalism? No, thank you, please.
Right.
So
with China in charge.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, it does sound like a bunch of scary Christian nationalism.
Yeah.
And so what?
You're right.
Yeah.
Christians are the only ones who are told to check their worldview at the door.
Yeah.
That's right. So Christians are the only ones who are told to check their worldview at the front door. And if you don't want Christian nationalism, then you're going to be left with secular nationalism. You're going to be left with Islamic nationalism, or you're going to be left with ultimately globalism, which I would argue secular nationalism and Islamic nationalism would ultimately lead to globalism. So why not embrace Christian nationalism? Now, this is very in line with what the founding fathers thought and is in topic with our discussion today about the oaths of office, swearing an oath to God, and the importance of having leaders who not only abide by the Constitution, but more importantly, abide by the worldview which made the Constitution, which is Christianity. Now, a few years ago, Nancy Pelosi, who you'll see here on screen, swore in one of the first Muslim congressmen into the United States House of Representatives. And you can see there he's being sworn in on 2 volumes. Now, that isn't the New and Old Testament. That is a copy of the Quran. Now, this is very interesting. This is the first time that ever happened when he was sworn in on the Quran instead of the Holy Bible. And I would argue that that is a massive red flag. because if you are being sworn into your office, taking an oath upon a religious text that is contrary to the worldview that built the United States of America and the West at large, then you probably have your loyalties in the wrong place. Now, let's define what an oath is. Now, the Webster's 1828 dictionary, which is a indispensable resource for all liberty-minded Americans, defines an oath as follows: a solemn affirmation or declaration made with an appeal to God for the truth of what is affirmed. The appeal to God in an oath implies that the person invokes his vengeance and renounces his favor if the declaration is false, or if the declaration is a promise, the person invokes the vengeance of God if he should fail to fulfill it. Now, when you read that, that doesn't sound like some ceremonial, non-binding, insignificant act. That sounds like what it says: a affirmation or declaration made with an appeal to God for the truth of what is affirmed. That actually taking an oath isn't just a promise to those who elected to you to that body, which in this case is Congress in the context we're talking, but it's also, more importantly, a promise you make to God, recognizing that your actions will be judged in eternity. Now, let's get into a little bit of what our founders said about this. This was William Lynn. He was unanimously elected the first U.S. House chaplain for Congress. So obviously somebody worth paying attention to. He said this, quote, "Let my neighbor once persuade himself that there is no God, and he will soon pick my pocket and break not only my leg, but my neck. If there be no God, there is no law, no future account. Government, then, is the ordinance of man only, and we cannot be subject for conscience sake." So what William Lynn, unanimously elected the first U.S. House chaplain, is saying here is that if we don't acknowledge God, if we don't acknowledge a future court of justice to come, then what will stop man from doing what is right in his own eyes, from picking the pocket of his neighbor, not only breaking his leg, but his neck? Because there would be no law, no future account, no accountability, no absolute moral truth. So we see the necessity of not only recognizing that all nations are built upon a moral and religious foundation, but recognizing that only one of those can be true, that is Christianity, and that is what made the United States so exceptional. Here is Chancellor Kent, New York Supreme Court Chief Justice. He noted very significantly in a case called People versus Ruggles in 1811 that irreverence to the Christian worldview weakens the effectiveness of oaths. He said this: Christianity was parcel of the law, and to cast insulting reproaches upon it tended to weaken the foundation of moral obligation and the efficacy of oaths. So let's marinate on that for a second. Christianity is the foundation of the law, and if you weaken that foundation, that moral obligation, then you weaken the oaths and the moral foundation, the moral compasses of those who are in the legal system. George Washington, in his farewell address, 1796, this is read in Congress every single year. First president of the United States, unanimously elected. Let it be simply asked, where is the security for prosperity, for a reputation, for a life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths, which are the instruments of investigation in the courts of justice? Now, that is a huge statement. If you get rid of any sort of sense of religious obligation, you then desert the oaths of office, which are the instruments in all courts of justice. Now, this makes sense. You think of the time in the 1700s when our founders were fleshing out this republic. They knew that the representatives would be removed from their homes, sent to the District of Columbia. There was no Twitter. There was no Rumble. There was no Substack. There was no C-SPAN. The people would not be able to see the actions, the words, the backroom conversations, the deals, the negotiations of their elected officials. But you know who does? God does. So if you elect men of moral and religious principle who swear an oath to God to faithfully uphold and defend the Constitution and all enemies, foreign and domestic, then the people don't have to watch every single word they say. Because ideally, that individual would know that if they compromise their oath, they will be held to account by a judge far more just and far more wrathful than their constituents, God Almighty. Alexis de Tocqueville, the author of Democracy in America, he came over from France to see what made the American Revolution and the American experiment different than the revolution in France. He said in 1831, while I was in America, a witness who happened to be called at the assizes of the county of Chester in the state of New York declared that he did not believe in the existence of God or in the immortality of the soul. So he goes to New York. He sees that a witness is called before a court, and this witness declares he doesn't believe in the existence of God or in the immortality of the soul. De Tocqueville continues, the judge refused to admit his evidence on the ground that the witness had destroyed beforehand all confidence of the court in what he was about to say. The newspapers related the fact without any further comment. So courts in America used to see the pagans, the godless, and say, well, how can we trust what you are going to testify before this body if you do not believe in God and absolute truth in the judgment to come? Now you can't even bring a Bible into a jury room in the United States of America. And we ask why we have injustice. We ask why we have the issues we have. Maybe it's because we've replaced one religion for another. Maybe through the lie being pushed through public education, through ivory tower college universities, that the separation of church and state is so foundational to our way of life, Christians have been cowering in the corner, not taking their religion, their faith, their worldview, their lives outside of the bounds of the church, if they even talk about these things within the bounds of the church, which they don't. And they have been duped into saying, well, our faith can't go beyond the church walls, if it's even there to begin with. And then that religion of Christianity, which made this country so exceptional, has been replaced with another religion, which is that of secularism. Dwight Eisenhower. You can beef with him all you want. You can have your disagreements with him. I do. But this statement is true. Quote, recognition of the supreme being is the first, the most basic expression of Americanism. If you don't believe in God, if you don't recognize the Christian worldview as the foundation of the West and America in particular, then you are missing out on the most basic expression of being an American. Well, maybe that was just a cultural thing back then, you'd say. Well, let's look at the constitutions of the colonies. The Constitution of the state of Pennsylvania, 1776, signed by Benjamin Franklin, stated in Chapter 2, Section 10, quote, each member, before he takes his seat, shall make and subscribe to the following declaration. Quote, I do believe in one God, the creator and governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good and the punisher of the wicked. And I do acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration. That doesn't sound like purely just some private cultural personal belief to me. That sounds like these guys wanted this implemented in the state. Because every law, every individual, every idea is supported by a worldview behind it. And you have to make a choice which worldview that's going to be. And there's only one that's right. And that's Christianity. South Carolina, their Constitution, 1778, Article 12. Every person who acknowledges the being of a God and believes in the future state of rewards and punishments is eligible to vote. The Constitution of South Carolina, 1790, Article 38 stated that all persons in religious societies who acknowledge that there is one God in a future state of rewards and punishments, and that God is publicly to be worshipped, shall be freely tolerated. Do you see the importance these guys saw in the recognition and belief of a future court of punishments and rewards by a just and almighty God? The Constitution of Mississippi, 1817, stated, "No person who denies the being of God or a future state of rewards and punishments," see that repeating of that future state of rewards and punishments, talking about a kingdom to come, a judge to come and to judge all men. "No person who denies the being of God or a future state of rewards and punishments shall hold any office in the civil department of the state." Christian nationalism is not to be condemned or afraid of. It is the truth that built our country. The Constitution of Maryland, 1851, required office holders to, quote, "a declaration of belief in the Christian religion. And if the party shall profess to be a Jew, the declaration shall be of his belief in a future state of rewards and punishments." There's that phrase again. In 1864, the Constitution of Maryland required office holders to make, quote, "a declaration of the belief of the Christian religion or of the existence of God and a future state of rewards and punishments." The Constitution of the State of Tennessee, 1870, Article 9, Section 2. Quote, "No person who denies the being of God or a future state of rewards and punishments shall hold any office in the civil department of this state." You will either be governed by the Bible or the bayonet. Make your choice. I would far rather be governed by, even if I'm not a Christian, I would far rather be governed by a worldview that says, love your neighbor. Don't take your neighbor's wife. Don't steal your neighbor's car or house or horse or carriage or buggy. Do not bear false witness. Forgive one another. These are the principles that created the republic we are living in today, that because of these men's religious character, because of these men's religious fervor to the Christian faith, we have the freedom to say such nonsense as, oh, separation of church and state. Oh, Christian nationalism's evil. If it wasn't for their rejection of the notion that religion had no place in the state, if it wasn't for their rejection of globalism and the rejection of Islamic nationalism and secular nationalism and embracing Christian nationalism, if it wasn't for their courage to do that, we wouldn't be talking here today. And yet we want to spit on their graves because we are so high and mighty. We are so educated. Give me a break. Pennsylvania Supreme Court stated in the Commonwealth v. Wolf, quote, "Laws cannot be administered in any civilized government unless the people are taught to revere the sanctity of an oath and look to a future state of rewards and punishments for the deeds of this life." Now, I skipped a slide here. Let's go and see what Justice James Iredell said. "Solemn appeal to the supreme being for the truth of what is said by a person who believes in the existence of a supreme being and the future state of rewards and punishments." Over and over and over again, we see this notion that our leaders must acknowledge God, the Christian religion, and the state of future rewards and punishments. Otherwise, who is to say they will not govern through the whims of a depraved and sinful and hateful and murderous and malicious human mind and heart? President Ronald Reagan stated in 1984, "Without God, there is no virtue, because there is no prompting of the conscience. And make no mistake, ladies and gentlemen, the conscience, the conviction of character. Remember Christian self-government? We dissected that at large a few episodes ago. That idea of Christian self-government, of the governing of one's conscience through a relationship with one's creator, that is inseparable with the First Amendment. That is inseparable with our right to property. That is inseparable with our right to keep and bear arms. If the people have no moral compass, no conscience, no Christian self-government, then they will be governed by the whims of the depraved and wicked human heart. G.K. Chesterton said, you will either be governed by the 10 commandments of God or the 10,000 commandments of man. William Blackstone, an Enlightenment thinker, a cornerstone of English common law, which inspired the founders, said the following: the belief of a future state of rewards and punishments, the entertaining of just ideas of the main attributes of the Supreme Being, and a firm persuasion that he superintends and finally compensates every action in human life, all of which are revealed in the doctrines of our Savior Christ. These are the grand foundations of all judicial oaths, which calls God to witness the truth of those facts, which perhaps may be only known to him and to the party attesting. You see, ladies and gentlemen, that in the void of Christian character, in the void of the application of the biblical Christian worldview, presents a grim alternative. An alternative where the heart of man, led astray through the depravity of a sin nature, would end up governing the affairs of humans. This is exactly what our founding fathers warned and worked against. John Adams, second president, founder, member of the Constitutional Convention, father of John Quincy Adams, future president, future congressman, future lawyer. He wrote in a letter to Judge F.A. Vanderkamp in 1850, "My religion is founded on the love of God and of my neighbor, in the hope of pardon for my offense upon contrition, in the duty of doing no wrong, but all the good I can, to the creation of which I am an infinitesimal part. I believe, too, in a future state of rewards and punishments." If you believe that you can get away with sin, if you believe you can get away with lying, that you can get away with deception, that you can get away with the trampling of God-given rights, you will do so. You will lie. You will cheat. You will compromise. But if you believe that you have a duty, if you believe there is a creator, if you believe he is omnipotent and all-knowing, if you believe every action in your life will be brought to account, if you believe that that creator came, bought you with a price, and redeemed you, you will operate on a different foundation. You will govern differently. This is true. Our final quote, Rufus King, very underrated founder. He was a signer of the Constitution. He wrote in 1821, wrote in the reports of the proceedings and debates of the Convention of 1821, assembled for the purpose of amending the Constitution of the State of New York, quote, "In our laws, by the oath which they prescribe, we appeal to the Supreme Being, so to deal with us hereafter as we observe the obligation of our oaths. The pagan world were and are without the mighty influence of this principle, which is proclaimed in the Christian system. Their morals were destitute of its powerful sanction. while their oaths neither awakened the hopes nor fears which a belief in Christianity inspires. The pagans, ladies and gentlemen, have empty oaths. They are neither awakened to the hopes or fears in Christianity. So, in summation, not only must we, as citizens of this great republic, govern ourselves individually in accordance to the belief that we will be held to an account for our actions and inactions, we must also require of those we send to represent us in the great halls of Congress, in the great halls of the Senate, in the great halls of the White House, in the great halls of the Supreme Court, in the great halls of our state legislatures, in the great halls of our governor's mansions, in the great halls of our state Supreme Courts, of our county executives, our county courts, our county legislators, our mayors, our city councils, our city courts. We must demand of them the recognition of reality, the recognition of a supreme God which will hold them accountable for their actions. And will people still make mistakes under this? Yes. But consider the alternative. Consider the alternative of a pagan, godless populace. Look around you. Look at the killing of Charlie Kirk, the stabbing of the Ukrainian girl on the train, the lawlessness in our streets. And consider the foundational cause of this chaos. Could it be, ladies and gentlemen, that our nation is decaying because we as a people have rejected God, have rejected his commandments, have rejected his moral order, and through a pious, proud, ignorant, nefarious heart, we have deemed ourselves more wise than our great forefathers? I would say that is exactly what has happened. And we can put a new president in. We can put a new Congress in that have ours by their name, that say they support freedom. But if they are not sold out to the King of Kings, we will not save our country. If we as a people from the bottom up are not fully committed to making America godly again, to speaking with our representatives in religious terms and through a Christian lens, we will not save this country. If we view our issues through a political lens and think of this as a left versus right struggle, we will lose. We are in a spiritual struggle. We are fighting against the father of lies, Satan, and his minions and his evildoers who want to move us away from Christian nationalism to secular globalism. And unless and until we fight and engage in this battle, knowing ourselves, knowing the enemy, as Sun Tzu taught us in The Art of War, and engaging in the fight as a spiritual one, if we do that, we have a shot. But we have to be a people who believes in a future state of punishments and rewards. We have to take our oaths seriously. You have an oath as a citizen to this country. You have an oath as a citizen to making this place better, not for yourself, but for your children and your grandchildren and posterity. And it's easy to look at the elected officials and say, look at their shortcomings. But who put the elected officials in their place so they could make said shortcomings? It's us. So we must lead well because we are led well by God. We must remember the importance of oaths, not because it's some ceremonious thing in some legalistic way, but because there is a broader truth and a broader heart disposition that acknowledges that we are fallen, that we are sinful, and that we need God. And that upon taking responsibility, we are accountable to God, for how we handle those responsibilities. This is the way forward. So, thank you for watching this. I hope it was enlightening to you. Leave a comment, like this, share it with a friend, share it with perhaps an elected official, if you would. Support our sponsors, ALP. Go back, click that QR code. Support the broadcast. And until next time, keep it local, keep it honoring, and keep it American made. We'll see you next time.